There's a painting up for us to enjoy. It's by William Blake, and it is the picture of the reading that Jim shared with us this morning of Zechariah in the holy place of the temple with the angel appearing to him. As we think about this reading, I want you to revisit some times in your life when you had something happen that shifted your direction. Maybe something good, positive, maybe something not so good, but something that made you maybe have a new understanding or make a decision or something that impacted you that changed your life. Now, I know that's a really easy question for all of us to begin with, so you're going to have to think about that this week. But I'll give you a couple of mine that came to mind just as examples. I had dated this new guy, and the day after our first date, he came to my workplace with a sweetheart rose tucked in the back pocket of his jeans. And I said to my girlfriend, I'm going to marry that guy. And I did. Big shift, right? Big shift. Things change. Another time I had read the Bible from cover to cover. I was looking for something. And then I prayed, and my prayer was answered right there, immediately. Changed the trajectory of my life. So think about those as we talk a little bit this morning. I want to tell you another story about someone who had one of those moments, kind of a weird moment that happened to him. His name is Jason Pollock, and he wasn't a particularly religious person. He went to church occasionally with his family, and when he was only 16 years old, he's laying in bed one night, and a feeling of something washed over him. And he had a certainty that he was going to be a priest. Now, his family rarely went to church, and Jason's first response to this feeling was, "Dude, you got the wrong number." He said that when they did go to church, he found it quite boring and full of old people. So Jason had nothing positive to say about this experience. He told a couple of his friends, and they laughed and said, "You are going to be a priest?" Right. But somehow that event, whatever it was, it changed him just enough. And we see the same thing today in our reading with Zechariah. This is a priest who goes into the holy place expecting to do one job, and something weird happens, and he has this conversation with an angel. Now, before we unpack that reading a little bit, let's get some context. Maybe you heard last week when the donkey was talking something about Rome, and this week something about Jerusalem. If we had had a message last week, we would have talked about Rome. Rome is representative of the place that imposes things upon us. Rome has decrees and laws and taxes and tells people what's going to happen to them, and its effects are far-reaching. And they often are things that we didn't sign up for. So in our own lives, it may not be necessarily the government, but it could be, hey, our bodies are getting older. Our bodies won't do what we planned for them to do or what we want them to do. That is imposed on us. None of us said, okay, I want to wake up not being able to move properly. That is something that happens. Maybe you have a medical diagnosis. You didn't sign up for that. That was imposed upon you. So Rome is the symbol of that which is imposed upon us, often against our will and without our consent, but we must live with. And in that condition, we look to the stories to give us hope. So last week, we would have looked at the nativity and the story to find hope in the midst of those situations that oppress us, that we have no choice about. This week, though, we are in Jerusalem, and that is called the city of peace. And we are searching for peace in the stories of the nativity. Now, Zechariah is in Jerusalem, and he is serving in the temple. And I want everybody on Zoom to be able to get an idea of this distance here between this back door and all the way up to the front of the sanctuary. So I'm going to walk back here and make you all nervous, okay? If this were the temple has a small area, but it has a huge courtyard. In fact, according to author and pastor Robert Fuquay, I think his name is, 35 acres. 35 acres was considered the Temple Mount. If you were a Gentile, you weren't a Jew, you were out in the parking lot. You didn't get any closer to that altar than the parking lot. Maybe the hallway, but I don't think so. I think they kept you at a long distance away. If you were a woman, a Jewish woman, you could get from the parking lot to a gate called the Beautiful Gate, and you would be in the fellowship room. And that is as far from there as a woman, or as close as a woman was allowed to be. So all the Gentiles, everybody else is in the parking lot. The women are in the fellowship room. Jewish men, next court, court of the Israelites, you get to sit in the pews. That's why they're so comfy. All the men are sitting here, and this is as close as they can get, right here. Jim would not be able to sit there because he's actually in the courtyard of the priests, which is up here. So the Jewish men can come this far, but they can't cross into this space. But Zechariah and the other priests, they can be up here. Now think about those poor Gentiles, how far away they are. Think about the women. They've got to see from back there. Now Zechariah, he's a priest, so he gets to come up here into this holy place. But beyond that is the most holy place, which is all the way up here. And nobody comes up here. This is curtained off. The Ark of the Covenant should be here, but that disappeared when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple of Solomon. And it wasn't found again, as far as I know, until the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indiana Jones found it, and it's somewhere in a warehouse. So Zechariah is here, and this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The priests don't all get to come into this space. This is also curtained off. It is the holy place. You're that far from God. It's so exciting. He's got to be so nervous. He gets to do it one time, and he'll never get to do it again. And some priests never get to do it at all. Now, what's in the holy place? We have a menorah. This has been bothering me the whole time. We don't have a menorah, so just pretend. It's a lampstand. And the flame is the presence of God. It represents the presence of God, the light of God in the world. And then there's a table that has bread on it, 12 loaves of bread for the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is the provision of God. So the presence of God, the provision of God. The Bible says, let there always be bread in the house of God. That's the bread. It's symbolic of God taking care of us. And then over here we have this representation of the incense altar. And this is all that Zechariah is going to take care of. When the incense is burning and the smoke is going up into the air, that is symbolic of the prayers of all the people rising up to the nostrils of Yahweh, and Yahweh remembers them. Now, while Zechariah comes into this space to take care of this incense, there are lots of Jewish men in the court of the Israelites, and there are lots of women in the court of the women, and they are waiting, and they are praying. And when Zechariah comes out, he is going to bless them. So that's what they're waiting for. But when Zechariah comes into this place, he's doing his work here with the incense, and this angel appears. Now, some of you are really logical. You're very rational. And you're thinking, okay, people don't have conversations like this with angels, right? It must just be a story. 69%, I think, of Americans believe in angels. We find great comfort in this idea that some kind of creature is here with us, something divine, something sacred, something special that is going to help us on our journey through life with all of its twists and turns. More than that, a higher percent believe in God and a lesser percent believe in the devil. But it doesn't really matter for this story whether or not you believe that it actually happened. And I'll explain to you. Let's go back to Jason, our 16-year-old who has this feeling wash over him that he's going to be a priest. He grows up a little bit, he goes to college, and instead of studying theology, he decides to study anthropology. He was curious, though, about that feeling, about that certainty that he was going to be a priest, and so he began to read his Bible. And he didn't get very far when he realized that he just didn't believe the stories. He read about Adam and Eve in the creation story, and he read about Noah and the ark and the flood. And he said, you know what? We know that it didn't really happen that way. It's just a story, so I cannot be a priest because I just don't believe these stories. In his studies in anthropology, he had to interview an Inuit elder. He had to travel all the way to the most northern part of Canada and interview this elder about their sacred artifacts. And as he's talking to this Inuit elder, the elder said, "Let me tell you the creation story." And in the Inuit story, there's this huge raven who is flapping its wings, and as it beats its wings, the world and the waters are formed. And the raven is delighted. The raven lands on the land, and when he pushes up his beak, he takes the form of a human. He plants pea pods all over the land, and after 5 days, one of these pea pods pops open, and a fully formed human pops out. And the raven looks at this person for a long time because he is astonished that his creation could produce a human. The human is hungry, so the raven goes to gather some berries and comes back with a couple of raspberries and a couple of strawberries, and the human gobbles them right down. And the raven says, "Oh, this human is hungry. I'm going to have to get more than this." So the raven plants vegetation all around the land so that the human will have food. And then the raven forms out of the dust of the ground all kinds of animals and birds and fish. And with all of this life, he notices that the human is lonely. So the raven goes someplace where the human can't see him, and he works with the clay of the ground and creates a female. And he brings the female to the male, and they all are in great joy. The vegetation is covering the earth, the animals are multiplying, the humans are multiplying, and Raven is delighted. When the elder finishes the story, he said to Jason, "Of course, we know it didn't happen that way. But these stories tell us who we are." These stories tell us who we are. These stories tell us who we are. Some of us will say, "Of course, we know it didn't happen that way," but that's not what the story's about. The story tells us who we are. So after Jason heard this, he decided to become a priest because he understood what the stories were for. Now, what does the story of Zechariah have to tell us? What was it that the author of the gospel wanted us to know? He was going to tell us the nativity story, but started back a step with Zechariah and Elizabeth and John. So what was Luke thinking about? Now let's remember that Luke was writing the story after the temple was gone. The Romans had destroyed it. It was a terrible thing to have been imposed on the people of Jerusalem. Their place of worship was gone. The priests were killed or unemployed after that. There was no place to worship. There was no place to offer sacrifice. And Luke's audience knows this. They've already seen it happen. And when they see and hear about this story, when they read these words or listen to these words of what God was planning in the temple before any of that happened, when God sent an angel Gabriel to talk to Zechariah to say, "Your son will be born and your son will create a new way, will make a way for people, for everyone to come closer to God." This is something that gives the people peace because they no longer have a temple. They are in that new way, and now they know that God planned it for them, that they are right where God wants them to be. Now, for some of us, Zechariah is much more like us than we think. How many of us have adult children who are not here? who don't attend church. The stories that nourish us and tell us who we are do not speak to them the same way. Zechariah has the same problem. His son is born, his son grows up, and then he doesn't see him. He's not in the temple serving with him. Can you imagine all the priests getting together in their little priestly area, and one priest might say, my son just finished medical school. He's going to start a practice right here in Jerusalem. And another priest would say, well, my son's studying theology because he's going to be a priest just like me. Zechariah, what is your son doing? I'm not sure where he is. I think he lives in the desert, and last I heard, he eats bugs. Wasn't he supposed to be someone great? I don't know what happened to that child. I thought he'd be right here with me in the temple. He's supposed to lead the parents and children together. He's supposed to bring all of Israel closer to God, but I don't know where he is. He's out there doing something. Haven't we had those thoughts before? Why aren't our kids here? This was so important to us growing up. These stories are things that we love. They tell us who we are, but they don't reach our children the same way. And that is how Zechariah was feeling too. And we know John the Baptist was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He was making a way where there is no way. He was creating a way to worship after the place of worship was destroyed. There was no place for people to worship, but John the Baptist was giving them a new way, and it was weird. And lots of the things that happen to us in our lives are weird. But this story that Luke wrote tells the people that God was in it all along. That God created a way that the worship would continue, that people would still tell the stories. It just wouldn't look the same because the Gentiles would not be out in the parking lot anymore. They would be having their own groups where they worshiped, where they studied the stories. Everybody would be included. And it was so much better. And these people that Luke was writing to needed to hear that, and so do we. We need to know that God is in it all. Even if it's hard for us. Can you imagine Jesus being crucified and then a few years later the temple is destroyed? What are people to think? Some would think God must hate us. But that's not the case at all. God is always at work and always doing something new, and the stories tell us that. So now I want you to go back again to where we started in your life. The turns and the shifts and the movement that your life made, not always with your consent, or maybe a decision you made, or an understanding that washed over you, or something weird like a conversation with an angel. Whatever happened, if you can go back now and look at those times, see how our faith in the stories brings you peace. Because that's what Luke wants us to understand today. It doesn't matter if Zechariah actually talked to an angel or not. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. No one was in that place with him. And he didn't write anything down that we know of. Think about your own life for just a few moments and see if you can find peace knowing the story that God was there all along.